Morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time to participate in this webinar. So, as the session is themed, we'll be talking about active management of riparian forests. I'm going to lead into it for probably the first 25-30 minutes with some background info from the research that I did in Coniferous riparian forests in the Sierra. And then after that, we'll kind of get into some broader management implications, and hopefully that'll generate some good questions. So, yeah, this first part we'll tackle is fire history, and I think that's an important component of riparian fire ecology to understand. Is kind of what the reference was back when we had an active fire regime, and that'll help inform how we look at riparian stand structure and fuel loads and fire behavior later on. So we've all kind of heard the general California, Sierra Nevada mixed conifer fire ecology story, where fire was once much more important a player and was much more frequent than it is now under current forest management. And we've largely been excluding a lot of management activities from riparian forests for quite some time, at least in the federal land management side of things. We typically have fixed width buffers around streams in which we can't do any active management, and that's starting to change. But we've still got quite a ways to go before we can have good dialogue about what we can really get back to that's ecologically meaningful as far as restoring riparian fire regimes. So anyways, we've been excluding fire from riparian areas and also excluding active management for a long time. So these are some of the highest risk areas on the landscape often for very severe fires, and they're also very sensitive areas that are terribly important for wildlife and aquatic values and water quality. So it's kind of a double a double whammy there. But let's move along. So the objectives of this study were basically to determine whether riparian areas used to burn differently under active fire regimes than adjacent upland areas, and to figure out what factors are influencing them, those historic riparian fire regimes. And so we looked at forest and site and stream characteristics as well as climatic conditions. We had quite a few hypotheses we were looking at having to do with length of fire return intervals and seasonality, and what forest types and precipitation regimes and topographic characteristics and channel characteristics and climatic influences, as well as a difference before and after Euro-American settlement. We were looking into all of these, and we'll get right into the meat of it. So we looked at the east and west sides of Tahoe Basin, Onion Creek Experimental Forest, which is just over the hill, and then I believe it's the North Fork of the American River watershed. And then we looked at the Almanor Ranger District of the Lassen National Forest, and we had 36 pairs of riparian and upland sites. And we were assessing differences between those. So the process, for those who aren't familiar with fire scar studies and dendrochronology, we went out into the woods and cut chunks out of fire-scarred trees and hauled them back to the lab, sanded them down, counted the rings, and saw which years the fire scars intersected the tree ring record. And then we also took some plot data looking at forest species composition and topographic characteristics, as well as channel characteristics in the riparian plots. And in the lab, we don't need to go too heavily into it, but basically we were looking at two different fire return interval types. One is what we call a broad filter, which we would count a fire anytime
For some
it
reason
started.
on my headphones, I can't hear it, so I had to call in.
Okay, a little bit of interference there. Anyways, we were looking at a broad filter fire return interval in which anytime a fire scarred a tree at a site, it would be recorded. So these could be very small-scale fires like single tree lightning strikes, all the way up to large-scale fires that just maybe scarred one tree and killed all the rest. And then we also looked at a narrow filter where we are looking for fires that only scarred 2 or more trees, and these could be thought of as perhaps wider spread fires, and trying to tease out kind of the differences between those two filters. We can talk about the stats afterwards if anyone has a lot of questions about that, but we used regression trees and non-metric multidimensional scaling, which is a type of ordination, to look at the relationships between forest and site and stream characteristics and the fire regimes. So we ended up pulling a little over 900 fire-scarred trees, which recorded 760 different fire events, and we ended up with a period of record extending from the late 1300s to the present. And if you look at this table here, you can see there's really not a lot of difference, especially if you look at the average fire return intervals between riparian and upland sites when we analyze them as with all the sites pooled together. So that's kind of one of the main themes of this presentation. Is in a lot of cases there isn't much of a difference between riparian and upland fire regimes, at least in the streams we looked at. Here's the full master fire chronology for all 32 sites, riparian and upland, kind of showing some synchrony even between sites. So each of those little tick marks is a big fire year at a given site, and you can see some of those tick marks line up. Time progresses from left to right there. You can see a lot of these sites aren't even close together on the landscape, so you can kind of infer that that was a big fire year, maybe a big lightning bust, maybe a very big drought year, or several drought years in a row. But basically, when you get down to it, riparian and upland fire return intervals were different, significantly different in very few sites. Maybe about a quarter of the sites when you look at the broad filter fire return interval, and a little bit higher percentage when you look at the narrow filter fire return interval. So that leaves about 3/4 of the sites that really showed no difference between riparian and upland fire return intervals. And this is a little bit hard to read, but basically the red and blue sites are ones where if you see the red and blue p-values there kind of in the middle of the table, sites that had significant differences, and you can see the blue ones are actually sites where the riparian fire return interval was shorter than the upland fire return interval, which is definitely counterintuitive compared to our hypothesis. And moving on, looking at seasonality, riparian and upland fire regimes were dominated by dormant season fires, which here in the Sierra Nevada, that's during the fall after the trees have stopped growing. And there wasn't a significant difference between riparian and upland seasonality, but you can see that riparian sites had definitely a trend toward fewer early season fires. So that's interesting. We'll get into that a little bit later on. So when we're looking at channel characteristics that are influencing upland fire regimes, it looks like stream depth and width to depth ratio are definitely associated with fire return intervals. So when you have a lower width to depth ratio, these would be kind of narrow in size streams. Those typically at a shorter fire return interval. And same thing with depth. Not smaller streams that weren't very deep, less than 1.3 meters deep, which would indicate usually a smaller channel, also had shorter fire return intervals. And looking at forest species composition, more pine was typically associated with shorter fire return intervals, and that's definitely fits the current paradigm in Sierra Nevada mixed conifer, thinking about fire return intervals. More pine is generally associated with frequent fire. And same thing, east side sites tended to have shorter fire return intervals than west side sites, and that's linked to an interaction between precipitation and veg type, most likely. And then looking at the narrow filter, these are fires that scarred 2 or more trees at a site. Again, it's riparian zone width, so wider, tends to have a longer fire return interval, and again, more pine, shorter fire return interval. And steeper channels had a longer fire return interval, which was kind of counterintuitive. That goes against one of our hypotheses. And then more incised channels typically had a shorter fire return interval. And in the uplands, again, more pine associated with shorter fire return interval, and elevation started to play more of a role for upland than riparian, with with sites over about 1,700 meters in elevation having a shorter fire return interval, which again is somewhat counterintuitive, unless you start thinking about lightning, which typically hits the upper elevation sites more often. And then looking at the narrow fire return intervals, so these are the narrow filter fire return intervals. These would be more widespread fires, again associated with species composition, more pine having a shorter fire return interval, and this time lower elevation having a shorter fire return interval. And so we're seeing kind of some battling signals here, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But essentially, with smaller scale fires being more frequent at high elevations and larger scale fires being more frequent at low elevations. And when we're looking at climatic signals, there was definitely an association between drought years and fire events at both riparian and upland sites. And then the upland sites had more of a signal tied to drought years than the riparian sites. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but it definitely makes some sense. And then when we're looking at the piece about before and after Euro-American settlement, whether there's differences, we saw very few significant differences before and after, and this is counterintuitive. This runs definitely against what most other fire return interval studies see in this region. Usually you see after Euro-American settlement a sharp drop in fire return intervals. Here we didn't see that at very many sites, and in some cases we even saw more frequent fire after Euro-American settlement. And a little bit of a spoiler, it's probably, my best guess would be that it's related to these, the Tahoe Basin and the Almanor district of the Alaska National Forest were very heavily railroad logged right around that time, and with railroad logging comes a lot of fire, a lot of human-introduced ignition sources. So we're seeing that riparian and upland fire return intervals don't differ at most sites, and that riparian areas often often don't act as a buffer to fire movement across the landscape. And we're not suggesting anything as to how they affect fire behavior, intensity and severity and whatnot, but just, fire occurrence. About a quarter of the sites did have different riparian and upland fire return intervals, and so that suggests that under some conditions, in some settings, riparian areas may act as an effective buffer, but more often than not, they don't. And we found a shorter fire return interval in riparian sites a couple times, and that could be due to higher fuel loads in riparian areas that are very productive compared to very unproductive surrounding landscapes. Sometimes, you get the very unproductive uplands that can't generate fuel fast enough to support a frequent fire regime, and so that's possible. Also, Native American burning in meadows along streams could also be responsible for the more frequent fire in riparian zones. The seasonality, this is typical. We usually see dormant season fires, late summer, early fall fires dominating. This trend of earlier season fires in upland areas could be due to the snowpack melting off earlier in those upland areas and the adjacent riparian areas. And, those snowed-in riparian areas, lasting into the early summer could limit spring fires. Composition-wise, we definitely expected this to find that, more frequent fires associated with more higher percentage of pine. And same thing, with the east side pine type, you would expect to see more frequent fires, so that was expected. Seeing shorter fire return intervals at low elevations for the more widespread fires was expected. But like I said, at higher elevations, small-scale fires were more frequent, and that makes sense when you think about lightning. Lightning strike density usually being higher at higher elevations, whereas maybe Native American burning and larger scale fires, dominated the low elevations. Shorter fire return interval on more incised, smaller streams makes sense. A lot of these streams we were seeing, are ones that you could step across. A lot of them have been down cutting for, quite some time due to, road density or previous mining activity, grazing, lowering the water table, and these real narrow streams with no riparian vegetation component left around it due to the lower water table. Fire can just run right across that. There's not even much of an effective riparian zone anymore to even slow down fire. We found that riparian fire return interval was shorter on lower gradient streams, and that was contradictory to our hypothesis. And it appears that fire occurrence is more highly correlated with drought in upland than riparian areas. And this suggests that under some conditions, in some places, riparian areas may be somewhat effective buffers to fire movement under all but the most severe droughts. And when you get, a good 10-year drought going and a hot day with a lot of wind, channeling right up the topographic features, even a good, wide riparian area probably isn't going to do much to slow fire movement. And then we found, like I said, not much of a difference between fire return intervals before and after 1850 Euro-American settlement, and we think that that's largely due to increase in fire occurrence due to railroad logging activity. So a brief overview of the management implications here. Local conditions are very important. We can't make any blanket statements about riparian influences on fire history and fire regimes, but it seems that riparian forests dominated by pine, especially in the eastern side of the Sierra Cascade crest, forests at low elevation and bordering small and sized streams probably had similar fire return intervals to upland forests and could probably be treated similarly if we get to the point where we can actively manage riparian areas. However, riparian forests dominated by fire-intolerant species, white fir, red fir, stuff like that. Those at high elevation and bordering wide streams with wide riparian zones probably had longer fire return intervals than the adjacent upland areas historically, and that might be where we want to see more of a difference in treatment between riparian and upland areas. And we'll get into all this a little bit later, just a little teaser on management implications. And so moving along to the next component of the study, let's look at stand structure, fuel loads, and potential fire behavior under current and reconstructed conditions. So the questions we're looking at here is, are current riparian upland forests different than they were historically? Are riparian forests currently different from upland forests, and were they historically different? And what was the relationship between forest conditions and fire regimes? So basically our three hypotheses here were that current forests are more prone to high-intensity fire than historical reconstructed forests, and that current riparian forests are more prone to high-intensity fire than current upland forests. And finally, that reconstructed riparian forests were going to be similar to reconstructed upland forests. And that's based on what we found in the fire history component. Mostly similar fire regimes. You would think they would have mostly similar forest structure at most sites. So a term we're going to be using a lot throughout the rest of this part of the presentation is prone to high-intensity fire. And what we mean there is higher basal area, higher stand density, more trees per acre, higher snag volume, higher fuel loads, and these will yield higher flame lengths, a higher probability of trees torching, a higher canopy bulk density, which is a measure of the fuel load in live tree crowns, and this will yield more mortality. And also low quadratic mean diameter, that means smaller trees, a lower canopy base height, so branches closer to the ground, lower fire-tolerant species dominance, so less pine, and a lower torching index and a lower crowning index. And for those who are not familiar with torching index and crowning index, that's basically the wind speed which is required to make a fire torch trees and then result in an active crown fire. And so, a lower wind speed that is required to torch out trees is indicative of, usually denser stands, higher fuel loads, more fire prone. And if people have questions about those measures, we can discuss them more fully at the end. Field methods, basically the same deal as the last study, but we'll get more into the plot data here. So we reconstructed stand structure and fuel loads at the time of the last fire for each plot, and mostly this was in the late 1800s. In some cases, we had fires as recent as the 1990s occurring in the plot, but for the most part we were able to reconstruct back to the late 1800s. And we based our reconstruction on species-specific equations from increment cores we took at each site, and we built relationships between the DBH of each tree and various other tree characteristics, so we could kind of reconstruct what these past forests looked like. And the hard part of this was reconstructing what dead trees, so snags, down logs, and stumps, what those used to look like back at our target reconstruction year. And we'll get into the nitty-gritty of those if you guys really want to later on, but I'm going to skip over it for now since it's pretty dense stuff. We reconstructed fuel loads with a little help from this great paper by Jan van Wagentonk that kind of lined up or correlated fuel loads with different stand structure components, so trees, sizes, and species. So that was very helpful. The most important thing to discuss here is the limitations of the reconstruction. We can only work with the trees currently on site, so if a tree fell over and died and decayed before we measured it, we can't know it was there, we can't reconstruct it. So the result is that the smaller tree sizes are probably less accurate. So densities of small trees and whatnot, take those with a grain of salt, especially in wetter west side sites that these small trees would have decayed pretty quickly. And then larger fuel size classes, your 1,000-hour fuels greater than 3 inches are more prone to error just because they have more variable deposition rates. You know, big branches don't fall down and populate the forest floors frequently as small branches. Fire modeling, we used the fire and fuels extension of FVS, and we got 97th percentile weather data from respective ROS stations close to our study sites to model fire behavior. And the variables we're looking at, basal area, stand density, snag volume, quadratic mean diameter, canopy base height, canopy bulk density, and species composition, and fuel loads. And then fire behavior variables, we're looking at flame length, probability of torching, torching and crowning indices, and mortality. And we did an ANOVA. This was a really gnarly model, and we can get into the nitty-gritty of that in the question and answer period if you guys want. And the point of this slide, if you look at those box and whisker plots, there's really high variability in all the measures that we looked at across all the sites among riparian and upland forests, both in current and reconstructed conditions. So it's again, you know, really hard to generalize. But basically, when we're comparing current versus reconstructed forests, current riparian forests have higher basal area, higher density, snag volume, higher fuel loads, higher flame length, a lot higher probability of torching, and a lower wind speed required to make those trees torch. And this results in, of course, about double the mortality in current riparian forests versus reconstructed historic riparian forests. And then for upland forests, same patterns. You know, they're way more dense. They're way more likely to exhibit extreme fire behavior and severe fire effects.
Carrie Green, you have a guest in the lobby.
Sorry about that. I guess I'm still hearing announcements over the intercom. Okay, so when we're comparing current forests, riparian versus upland, we're seeing that riparian forests currently are more dense than upland forests. They usually have smaller trees, branches lower to the ground, fewer fire-tolerant species, and higher probability of torching and mortality. And that's to be expected. You know, riparian forests are very productive, and we haven't been managing them actively for over 100 years. And for the results for our third hypothesis, when we're comparing reconstructed riparian and reconstructed upland forests, we did not find a significant difference in any of the variables analyzed. And that's a key point. Right now, there's this huge difference between riparian and upland forests, with riparian forests being much more fire-prone. And historically, that was not the case. And so when we look at some of the relationships between forest characteristics and fire return interval, you know, it seems like fuels is really what's driving things here. You know, fuel loads were very highly correlated with fire return interval, down woody fuels as well as canopy fuels. Down woody fuels being the driver in the upland area and canopy fuels being the driver in the riparian area. And then when we look at relationships between riparian and upland variables, there's a lot of linkages between riparian and upland basal area, canopy bulk density, snag volume, flame length, and probability of torching. But historically, most of the linkages occurred with tree diameter, canopy base height again, species composition, flame length, probability of torching, and mortality. So it seems like historically there were a lot more correlations between riparian and upland stand structure and fire regimes than there are now. Now there's kind of a big disconnect between what's going on in the fire regimes and forest structure of riparian versus upland forests. And when we look at differences in sampling areas, this is just kind of an afterthought, but the east side of the Tahoe Basin was consistently less fire prone, and the west side of the Alaska National Forest was usually the most fire prone. And if you've been in those two places, you can picture it. The east side of Tahoe, still relatively open, piney forests. The west side of the Lassen, very wet, very dense, a lot of Doug fir and white fir ingrowth. So I want to preface this discussion by saying that these results do not imply that forests should be reconstructed or restored to reconstructed conditions. It's probably not possible. It's definitely not desirable to try and recreate the past. But if we can emulate the processes under which forests evolved, in this case it's frequent low-intensity fire, we should be able to get something that'll survive in the future, with what we're looking at coming down the pipes with climate change. We're going to be seeing a lot more frequent fire, and I think this summer is going to be a huge example of that. We're seeing, a really early start to fire season, and so if we can get our forests in shape where they can survive active fire regimes again, we'll be looking at probably having forests to share with our descendants. So variability was usually higher in riparian forests. That makes sense. They're a lot more productive, so you're going to have a lot higher range of conditions possible there. And again, there was high geographic variation, so it's really hard to generalize these results. Here's some stand visualizations to kind of help you grasp the picture. The upper row is current conditions. The lower row there is reconstructed conditions. And the left-hand side is riparian forest. The right-hand side is upland forest. And these are just some relatively representative stands, so they don't epitomize all the points we hit. But you can see that currently riparian and upland forests are a lot more dense than they were historically, and a lot greater small tree component in there than they did have historically. So to kind of recap, riparian and upland forests are currently a lot more prone to high-intensity fire than they were historically. And there's a few things that kind of appear to contradict this, but they're mostly associated with how fast small trees have been growing into these forests, kind of dragging down the current tree sizes and canopy base heights, and even resulting in less fine fuel deposition. Current riparian forests are a lot more prone to high-intensity fire than current upland forests, so there's a huge disconnect, and that's due to, again, high productivity in riparian areas and not really managing them at all for the last century. And then reconstructed riparian upland forests were not significantly different. This makes sense because they historically had similar fire regimes at most sites. So the management implications here are that riparian forests should be a high priority for restoration. A lot of times the objectives should be similar to upland forests, to restore conditions that can survive an active fire regime. We can do this by reducing basal area and stand density and removing small fire-intolerant trees. Reduce surface fuel loads, especially duff. Duff buildup was huge compared to historic conditions, and that's, again, due to not having any fire in a lot of these places for a long time. And as always, you've got to account for local conditions. You've got to focus on producing heterogeneity at the stand and landscape scale. You know, we're not saying that we should prescribe, uniform low-density stands in riparian and upland forests and make everything look alike. That's not desirable. That's not feasible. And so we'd like to acknowledge all of our collaborators on this project. It was a huge effort, and we had a lot of help from a lot of people. And with that, I will take any questions, and maybe we can continue the discussion about management implications. All right, so
this Richard's coming on. My computer just crashed, so I'm coming back onto the site. Mike, perhaps you can see if there's any questions in the chat box for Kip and then cut them into the center, and then maybe you can come on the line and read the questions for Kip because I'm still booting up here.
Okay, thanks, Richard. So, Kip, there's one question from Julie. She asked, how accurate do you think that the reconstructions are, and how do the reconstructions account for trees that were removed as a result of logging?
Well, I think reconstructions, being what they are pretty accurate. We used methods that have been used in a lot of other reconstruction studies, and our results validate or are validated by what most other reconstructions have found. Again, they're less accurate for small trees, and they're less accurate in those wet west side forests just because things decay a lot faster. But we did account for trees removed during logging. That's one of the parts of the reconstruction details I kind of glossed over. We accounted for logging by looking at the stumps that we found in our plots, and we could look back and find historical timber sale records for a lot of stuff on Forest Service ground. And then there's an excellent kind of science review for the Tahoe Basin that shows the years in which various areas of the basin were logged, and that was really helpful in Tahoe. So hopefully that answers that question.
So there's a second
some more
question.
if there's more that needs to be said.
If there's a second question there from Brooke, and that is there an effort to do what you've done in more arid southwestern landscapes?
Yes, there is. That's a great question. I used some of the reconstructions, I believe, what's the guy's name? With the Ecological Restoration Institute there at NAU. Pete Foulet did a really good reconstruction. I believe it was at the north rim of the Grand Canyon. I can find that paper a little bit later and email it to, maybe I'll email it to Richard or Mike, and they can send it to you. Or type your email in the chat box there, and I'll send it out.
We have their email addresses from when they registered, so assuming that Brooke registered for the webinars, we would have her email address or his email address.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'll get some of those southwestern forest reconstruction studies to you.
You might want to note too also, Kip, that your paper, your published work is available on that VTAC site that I gave the URL for before. And it's also posted on our webinar site under the resources. Who's been kind of leading the charge on reconstruction down in the southwest at NAU.
Are you back online, Richard?
Yeah, I am. So Silver Hartman has joined us, and she asked, did you look at a riparian hardwood component in any of your study plots?
Yeah, there were actually a couple plots that did have some aspen and cottonwood in them. And I can tell you specifically which ones those were if you're interested. I'll email that to you, and you can look at kind of the nitty-gritty data for those specific stands. But basically,
email it to me, Kip. Email it to me, because I have Silver's email address. I can just forward it directly on to her.
Okay, good deal. Yeah, I'll get that to you. But basically, and we don't have any, or we didn't collect any hard data on, on the hardwoods, other than noting their presence, and that they feed into the stand structure. But I didn't really see any strong signal differentiating those from other sites nearby that didn't have a hardwood component. And that's not to suggest that they historically didn't have a different thing going on. But, all the stands we looked at, the hardwoods are just kind of hanging on by the skin of their teeth, getting shaded out and overgrown by, adjacent conifers. I can tell you my thoughts on dealing with fuels in cottonwood and aspen groves. My thoughts are that currently you have a lot of ingrowth of white fir and other shade-tolerant species up through the canopies, which were probably historically dominated by hardwoods. And really high fuel loads because of all the down-woody fuels that these young conifers are dropping to the forest floor. And, it's likely that if you get a fire moving through there, especially, it seems like the low to moderate intensity fires are the big problem that, in these hardwood stands that are overgrown by conifers. You'll get kind of a low to moderate intensity fire that might not kill the, somewhat mature conifers, but it'll kill the hardwoods since they are thin-barked. But if you still have that conifer overstory, you're not going to get enough sunlight to really support regenerating hardwood stand. So my thoughts on that would be get the conifers out of there, and then do a reasonably high intensity prescribed fire to clean up the fuel load, to kill any residual conifers, and to provide some mineral soil for a regenerating stand. And again, another important component of this is the hydrologic regime.
Jerry Van
These are heavily altered in most streams in the Sierra Nevada, and you might not even have the stream conditions and the water table conditions anymore to support a regenerating hardwood stand. So you've also got to look at restoring hydrologic regimes in addition to fire regimes if you want to retain and perpetuate that hardwood component. Hopefully that answered your question.
There's Silver, you weren't at the first presentation by Joe McBride, but you might want to view that recording because Joe talks about some studies he did in the Sierra on fire impacts on riparian areas and the strategies really for regeneration of the conifers versus the hardwoods. And I know for the Anguilla fire, the recovery of the aspen and willows and the herbaceous was almost immediate.